Thank you, Shona, and particularly thank you to Joe for inviting me here. I've been at the summer school before, and I just think it is the best summer school, and long may it last, and thank you, Joe. About 2 weeks ago, I was looking at what I might say at this summer school, and then Joe very kindly sent me an email and said, well, maybe you'd focus on the women. So that's what you're going to get. For the first five decades of this state, the church and state colluded, in my opinion, at many levels to control the lives of its citizens, especially women. Recently, Archbishop Dermot Martin stated that not only should Pope Francis apologise for clerical sexual abuse, but also for the Magdalene laundries, the mother and baby homes, and other places where stories of abuse have recently emerged. Brendan Hoban, a founder of the Association of Catholic Priests, in a book called Change or Decay, described how in recent decades we have lived through betrayals of trust, episcopal misadministration, and incompetent leadership, as well as declining congregations. The state in the past willingly allowed the church to provide facilities and activities that the state really couldn't do in the early part of the century. So the church did take over education and healthcare, and at many levels the state was very grateful for that because they were really not able to do it at the time. But of course, by doing that, they also conceded policies about education and healthcare to the church. And at one level, I think the Irish state has moved on from that, but I also think that it's reflected in the other way, that it wasn't really very good for the church, because the church had a very acquiescent citizenship, had very acquiescent politicians who accepted everything that the church wanted, if you like, in legislation. So the church's policies were in all our legislation in many ways, and spectacularly in our constitution. It seems to me that for those early decades of the state, and the state did very well from where it came from, but that politicians were Catholics first and legislators second. I think recent times now have indicated that they are now legislators, and they're still able to hold onto their faith. So if you look at some of the things that have happened in Ireland recently, or if you look, I'm going to go back a little bit first. Maybe you will remember what was in the Constitution in relation to the special position of the Catholic Church. Article 44 said, the state recognises the special position of the Holy Catholic, Apostolic and Roman Church as the guardian of the faith proclaimed by the majority of the citizens. That was removed in 1972. Another article that was in the Constitution, Article 41, said no law shall be enacted providing for the dissolution of marriage. That too was removed in 1996. Contraception wasn't actually in the Constitution, as we know, but it was banned within Ireland for a significant amount of time and was a direct response to a church teaching of the 1930s. And what it said, that church teaching said, I think Shona actually has quoted it, but any use whatsoever of matrimony exercised in such a way that the act is deliberately frustrated in its nature to generate life is an offence against the law of God and of nature, and those who indulge in such are branded with the guilt of a grave sin. Now, the Western world has moved on significantly, and we talk about the sensus fidelium. The majority of Catholics across the world did not accept that. But I recently read an article about women in the Philippines, and I suppose it was disappointing to read that women in the Philippines have suffered enormously, and other women in undeveloped countries where this ban on so-called artificial contraception is still in place. A wonderful line in 1971, and maybe some of you are old enough to remember, there was a group of women who went to Belfast who came back, there's loads of video images of it, on a train with all kinds of contraceptive devices. And the Bishop of Clonfert at the time, Thomas Ryan, this was his response to those women. He said, never before, and certainly not since penal times, was the Catholic heritage of Ireland subjected to so many insidious onslaughts on the pretext of conscience, civil rights, and women's liberation. Other significant changes have, as we know, happened in Ireland, and the reference there sort of in the slide. Homosexuality was finally decriminalised in 1993. Then we had the Marriage Equality Act of 2015, the Protection of Life and Pregnancy Act in 2013, and this year the removal of the Eighth Amendment, allowing for termination of pregnancy in certain circumstances. So there has been a seismic shift in public policy. But I think one of the things that might be important perhaps to say is, who is the church today? Who speaks for the church? And when we speak of church, what do we mean? I mean, there is the institution, which we're all aware of, the institution, the magisterium, the official church, and then there is the church that I call the people of God, which, if you're familiar with the documents of Vatican II, was one of the key lines that we are all the church. And I belong to this reform group called We Are Church Ireland. It is an international group. It is very small, but our primary advocacy is to implement the findings and the insights of Vatican II. And it has often struck me that as a member of the church, I have never heard anybody in my, if you like, vicinity, any member of the church, of the leadership of the church, give us talks or seminars really on Vatican II. Now, maybe they have, and maybe I missed them. I have read the documents, and I'm quite well informed about them, but Ireland, as the official church, really never wanted to propagate those documents, and that seems to me to still be the way today. Sometimes we talk about the marks of a church as being mass attendance. But I would argue that that's not the only criteria for measuring the faith of a people or of individuals, that there are other metrics that are far more important. That the marks of a real Christian church would be more meaningfully analysed by seeing how those church members respond to the needs of all, how it treats everybody with equal dignity and respect, and how it practices particularly justice in all their relationships. The church really officially cannot preach justice and then be unjust towards its own members. And I think particularly of the 6 Irish priests, 2 of them theologians, who have been silenced in recent years. And I would totally accept that under Francis' regime, nobody will be silent. He does want people to have dialogue. However, there are many, and I echo what Joe said there are many of us sort of in a grey area. And maybe we try to follow the example of Jesus. We try to be Christian. And there are many who've now left the church, but there's a phrase, and sometimes a little bit pejorative, used by Karl Rahner, a great theologian of the Second Vatican Council, who talked about anonymous Christians. I think Ireland is still full of many anonymous Christians who try to follow the Christian way, but are constantly obstructed really by the official church. So part of the questioning today was, does the church, what is it meaning for Ireland today? And again, I can quote Pope Francis and commend what he says. It exists to serve humankind, not for its own sake. It exists to serve humanity. Would that was the way the official church in Ireland operated. The good news of the gospel is the reason for Christianity, and its purpose is to transform us and our world to a humanity where love is the driving force behind all activities, that it reflects that wonderful phrase that appears in all the Gospels over 160 times, the kingdom of God, a time when the values of love, justice, forgiveness, compassion, reconciliation dominated our world. I think that is the challenge, particularly for the official church in the years ahead. How can it transfer those values that are so dominant in the Gospels into the life that we live? So we now come on to something to do with women. A discipleship of equals are a problem. I do get really tired of hearing that women are the problem in the church. If the church is to survive, in my opinion, and if it is to flourish, it can no longer ignore the serious involvement of at least half of its membership, and probably more, because if you go to church services in Ireland, you'll find that there are far more women at this point in time than men, and they're doing all kinds of things to help that church survive. A theologian that I love dearly is Joan Chichester. She's a Benedictine nun, but a very, very accomplished theologian. And what she said was, quote, "The church that preaches the equality of women, but does nothing to demonstrate it within its own structures, is dangerously close to repeating the theological errors that underlay centuries of church-sanctioned slavery." Regrettably, though I admire much of what Pope Francis is trying to do, women do seem to be his Achilles heel. He constantly says that there's a special status for women, but that seems to me to be contradicted by much of his other statements. His language reveals an outmoded and disturbing understanding of the lives of women. He speaks of a feminine genius. He speaks of the need for a deeper theology of women. And he says women are a mystery. Now, am I a mystery? Are the women sitting here a mystery? I mean, that one really does get to me. And actually, Mary MacGill said recently at a talk that I was asked, she said, do you know what? If they just talked to us, they'd realise we weren't a mystery. And regrettably, he also talked about women theologians. And what he said about them was that they were strawberries on the cake. Yeah, it's very regrettable, and even making allowances for language, I just don't understand that. He compared grandmothers, and I am a grandmother now, so on two accounts I'm really in a bad place. You know, I'm a strawberry and I'm a grandmother. He said that, talking about Europe, he said that Europe was like grandmothers who were infertile and lacking vibrancy. Yeah. And as I said, he didn't speak of grandfathers in the same terms. Okay? The consecrated woman, he said, must not be an old maid. And when he was asked if there was a bit of misogyny in the background to some of these comments, he jokingly said, well, woman was taken from a rib. And I really don't believe that could be his theology, that he believes that women were taken from a rib. But he has made all those other statements, and they are well documented. The problem seems to me the persistence of a narrow vision of women, dominated by thoughts about their ability to bear children. So delinking women from this one-dimensional view of what it means to be female, to me, is the most urgent necessity if women are to be treated as disciples of equality. The constant institutional use of the complementarity term to understand women, and this informs all the official church teachings. This notion of complementarity really is a key to their understanding of male and female. It focuses on women's childbearing capacity as her source of identity. And value is a problem that runs deep and is anchored by many papal writings. So this notion of complementarity, that men and women complement each other. So women are here and men are there. Again, I think recent findings have demonstrated differently. Another theologian that I admire greatly is Mary Hunt. And again, what she says, to quote, she says, the growing biological and social scientific consensus in favour of the broad range of ways in which human beings live out their gender identity undermines the fragile and indefensible sexist and heterosexist anthropology on which the Catholic teaching on human sexuality is based. I think it is really regrettable that the Catholic Church does not have a good theology of human sexuality. It is stuck somewhere in the Middle Ages. And because it constantly uses this reference of complementarity, it cannot get any further. And I actually think we do need a good theology of human sexuality. And there are some theologians, in particular one, a nun, Margaret Fairley, who's written a brilliant book called Just Love about it. I thoroughly recommend it. And when she wrote that book, of course, she was slated. Now, she wasn't silenced. And all she was doing in the book was trying to say, could we have a dialogue about these issues? Are there insights that we need to examine? And what strikes me is it's most extraordinary that when the Church, or when Francis, and when they produce papal encyclicals, and particularly Laudate Si, a wonderful encyclical about the environment, the Church goes way outside its own brief. It's informed by experts and up-to-date scientific information, and out of that it then formulates how the gospel values can be integrated into the policies, into the teaching. But when it comes to women and human sexuality, none of that happens. There's almost two parallel methodologies in how it approaches social, economic, justice issues, and then how it approaches women and sexual issues. The continual policy to exclude women is really extraordinary also in the light of the scriptures. And it was only when I went to study theology that I realized that women were everywhere in the life of Jesus, that Jesus founded a movement, and that men and women were everywhere. They were at the foot of the cross, they were the first messengers of the resurrection. There is enough historical, archaeological evidence to say that women were leaders in the early church. And I think, I don't know if I have it there, but I have a picture of this woman here in blue is Junia. And it is interesting that as times rolled on, Junia, who was a female leader, a very significant leader of the early church, she became, in the writings, Junius. So she changed, she had a transmogrification from female to male. That says a lot as well. So I'm just briefly going to reference the ordination issue and then one more element about diversity. In all of this, of course, the ordination issue keeps arising because in the Catholic Church currently, only ordained men can be involved in any decision-making. Many inside the church say that this can never be changed. Pope Francis says that it's a closed door, and I think Kevin last night said to me, well, sometimes closed doors can be opened, but I'm not that optimistic about that at all. Ordination never happened in the time of Jesus. He did not ordain anybody. Absolutely nobody. So why do we keep constantly saying that Jesus ordained people in the Gospels? In fact, even if you want to reference the 12 apostles, they were all Jews. No doubt they were all also circumcised Jews. So, if we want to sort of transfer exactly the fundamentalism that sometimes is out there, that's what we would have to say about priests. The 12, all the theological and scriptural findings reference the 12 as reflecting the 12 tribes of Israel. And just to say, I'm a graduate of Trinity College, and Trinity College, I proudly can say, women entered Trinity College in 1904. To study, and it was the first university really in these parts of the world to do that. Oxford and Cambridge actually came later. But it was interesting, there was a battle royal fought over the entrance of women to Trinity College, and the teachers in Alexandra College and Loretto nuns, lovely combination there, were very much part of the battle to have women be allowed study in academia. But the provost of the time was a man called Salmon, and he was very, very opposed to women entering Trinity. And these were the reasons he gave. And I sometimes think these reasons are part of this church's thinking of what women are about. And he said, women's brains were too small for third-level study. Oh, it's much worse than that. They would be a distraction to the men. God forbid. And never mind that, the men might have been a distraction to them, but that wasn't said. And then he said they might miss every fourth week in a month because of female menstruation. And then he said, once inside the gates, you would never know what they might do or where they might go. Perhaps that is part of the church's thinking about allowing women to be ordained. He also said, interesting enough, that it would be over his dead body that women would enter Trinity College. However, in 1904, 1 year later, he was dead. And the first 7 women, wonderful, wonderful, courageous, brave women, entered Trinity College. Anyway, that discrimination does continue, because just yesterday I read in the Tablet, a wonderful publication, if you're familiar with it, where Cardinal Raymond Burke said that altar girls led many boys to abandon altar service, as they didn't want to do things with girls, and they drifted away. Plus ça change, as they say. Finally, I would just like to, and I hope I haven't gone on too long, because I tried to cut it down, inclusion or exclusion, is that the issue? I suppose we were all transformed or transfixed by the Thai rescue operation. And the Irish-Belgian diver, Jim Warney, pointed out that it was one of the downfalls, but one of the successes, that because there was no one authority and no one person had the complete answer, it works. The world stood in awe of the teamwork. Different nationalities, languages, cultures, religious identities, diverse skill sets found answers to the challenge. Doesn't mean that leadership isn't important. I think leadership and diversity are not mutually exclusive. We do need both. The Harvard Business School professor Francesca Gino said, quote, "That our decisions get sidetracked by biases is now well established. While it is hard to change how our brains are wired, it is possible to change the context of decisions by architecting the composition of decision-making teams for more diverse perspectives." Every organisation that I'm familiar with at the moment believes and practices diversity in its format. Professor Ivan Apfelbaum of MIT also said, diverse teams spend more time deliberating important decisions. While more homogeneous groups were more prone to falling into a groupthink, where mistaken opinions are more likely to spread. This research is now accepted in all organisations. Inclusive teams enrich employment pools. Could they not enrich the church, is my question. They have representatives in organisations of different genders, races, nationalities and skill sets, enrich the company's intellectual potential. Now, I know all that was written very much in terms of perhaps money and improving the productivity of organisations, but I do think the Catholic Church could learn something from that. Finally, Hans Kung has said that the crisis in the Catholic Church is not of the faithful, but of church leadership. Cardinal Sean O'Malley of Boston, who came to Ireland on an apostolic visitation, made some very serious comments. He said, "Ireland has only 5 or at most 10 years before it could fall over the brink and be reduced to a tiny minority irrelevant to society. It seems to me, and it is just my opinion, that the institutional church, as opposed to the community of the faithful, the people of God, is trying to fly on one wing. It's breathing on one lung by discounting the serious involvement of the diversity and diverse talents of women. It will not be sufficient, I might add, to appoint safe women. Francis has appointed a number of women to positions in the Vatican, but there is a difference between diversity and safe women. The analogy I would like to use is one of an orchestra, because music is one of my passions in life, and I'm a regular visitor to the concert hall. But it is only when every section of the orchestra plays to a strength that you get the perfect sound. Women, I would contend, need to be treated on the basis of their humanity. None of this complementarity, not based on the womanhood, not based on the fact that they give birth to children. That, to me, would be a much more Christian way to proceed and would be my desire for the church. I just think, in conclusion, that Olivia O'Leary, I would like to echo what she said yesterday in her sentiments about the school. I think this is a brilliant school. I think it has been unfairly criticised. I think, as Olivia said, Joe did listen and he did change the agenda. And gosh, if the Catholic Church could only take that model, wouldn't it be a different place? In short, I would just like my church to be more Christian. And I really don't think I'm a strawberry on the cake. Thank you very much.